one thing I'll say is I normally serve the younger youth. So their attention span is that of a goldfish, so 3 seconds. So that's why I normally don't make my talks any longer than 20 minutes. I know today we have a kind of time slot of 1 hour, but no way will I be able to talk for an hour. So I'll give a very short presentation, and I want this to be as interactive as possible. So please join in. And whilst I was preparing this, Abuna John was also sending me very nice quotes by the church fathers, etc. So he obviously is very knowledgeable. So it'll be great to get his input at the end. So in terms of women's role in the church, I know that girls in general, or feminists, are always fighting for women's rights in society, and we want women to be more equal with men, etc., etc. Me personally, as a girl growing up in the Coptic church, I've never felt like the church was unfair, or I've never felt, oh, as a girl, I'm a kind of second-class citizen in the church and we should be fighting for our rights. I think the church is really, really honours women. So I hope that's what I'll be kind of able to demonstrate today. So I thought, kind of as a logical sequence, we will take women in the Old Testament and then take women in the New Testament and then take women in the kind of church and modern day life, okay? So please, I can't see anyone because I'm screen sharing, so if you've got your hand up or anything, I won't be able to see you, so please just unmute yourself and just ask a question or say any comments during it. If not, we can have a discussion at the end, whatever you prefer. So if we start off with thinking about the role of women in the Old Testament, we'll go to the very, 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 very beginning, when God created Adam and Eve. How did he create them? And did he create them equally? Was there a difference between them? Was one more superior than to the other? So, Abel, can you read this verse out for us, please?
And the Lord God said, "It's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him."
Okay, so I underlined the word comparable. God didn't say, I'll make him a helper superior to him. I'll make him a helper to serve him. I'll make him a helper, he said, I'll make him a helper comparable to him. And comparable can be like another word for comparable could be equal. So from the very, very beginning, God created us the exact same. Apart, obviously, from biological differences, there's no difference in our value. We both were created in God's image. There's no difference at all. And there's a man called Matthew Henry. He's written, I think, 6 volumes of commentaries on the Bible. I've not read his commentary, so I'm not sure if that's something that the church supports or not, but this is a quote that's not to do with any dogma or anything, but he spoke about Eve's creation. So Tia, can you read this out for us?
Eve was not taken out of Adam's head to top him, neither out of his feet to be trampled on by him, but out of his side to be equal with him, under his arm to be protected by him, and near his heart to be loved by him.
Yeah, so I felt this was something really, like a really lovely commentary, that she was taken from his side to be equal with him, not from the head to be superior to him, not from his feet to be inferior to him, but from his side, she's equal to him. And this is the way Adam viewed Eve from the very start. So Philip, can you read this verse out for us?
Yeah, sure. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh."
So from the very beginning, Adam viewed him and Eve as one. She's like, no, she's part of me. She's bone of my bones. She was taken out of him, flesh of my flesh. So he never saw her as anything less than him. She was bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. So that was from the very, very, very beginning. This was God's God's desire for us to be equal, and this is how we lived. This is how Adam saw Eve. So if we kind of go through the Old Testament, obviously the Old Testament was the kind of Jewish era, very male dominant, lots of wars, lots of things like that. But even despite all of that, there were some really, really great women. So this is Miriam, who was she was a prophetess, the sister of Moses. And she kind of led the people in praise as they crossed the Red Sea. And actually in the midnight praise, we mentioned her. Then I can't remember the exact line, but Miriam took the timbrel, something like that. So we mentioned her in the midnight praises. She was a prophetess. We have got Deborah. She was one of the judges of Israel. So again, that's a very, very powerful leader role. And because of her, Israel, I think, enjoyed peace for 40 years. So that's she was the only female judge, but that was a very, very powerful position, especially kind of in that society and in that culture. We've also got Esther. She showed great courage because she was like, I'm going to go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. But all she cared about was saving God's people and saving her people, and through her wisdom and through her bravery, she saved them. So we can see that throughout the Old Testament, there have been examples of really brave women who had a major influence in society. They were basically heroines. They saved God's people. Moving on to the New Testament, obviously we've got St. Mary, but we'll leave St. Mary to the side for now. She will be discussed separately because of how great she is. But again, it's a great honor to think that the first person to have to experience the resurrection, or the first person to preach the resurrection, was Mary Magdalene. Actually, she shamed men in that time because the disciples were in the upper room trembling with fear, just kind of all together, locked up, hiding away. But she went whilst it was still dark on Sunday morning, on the early hours of Sunday morning. She went and she asked where her beloved was. So she had the honor of being the first person to preach the resurrection. And that again was because of her love and because of her courage, because the disciples, those who should have been closest to Christ, were away hiding. The book of Acts is full of lots of women who helped St. Paul in his service, or just in the early church. So Clara, will your voice manage to help you read this verse, or would it be too difficult?
Yeah, I can. I commend to you Phoebe, your sister, who is a servant of the church in Cenchreae, for indeed she has been a helper of many, and of myself also.
Thank you, Clara. So I'm losing my voice as well. So yeah, in the book of Acts, the women in the early church, they were there to kind of do what we would kind of almost consider like the charity work. So they would, after the kind of liturgies, they'd prepare the food, they'd look after the widows. If anyone was kind of coming into the faith before they were baptized, they would sit with, like any girls, they would sit with these women who had helped them and teach them about the faith. And for example, here, St. Paul is commending Phoebe and saying, she has been a helper of many and of myself also. And if I'm not mistaken, I read that Phoebe was the one who carried the epistle of the Romans from Corinth to Rome, and she also helped explain it. So she had a very, very active role, and she wasn't the only woman. The book of Acts is full of people, not just the book of Acts, the time of the early church is full of women who helped the apostles in their ministry, because the apostles had a very specific ministry, so they couldn't do everything. So they kind of devoted themselves more to the liturgical services and the preaching, whereas the women were there to kind of do more of the kind of other kind of social side of services. There's this woman also called Tabitha, or I think in some translations her name's Dorcas, and again she was there to make clothes for the poor, and when she died there was great mourning because of how loved she was because of all her works, and she was raised from the dead. But again, it shows how much women had a really important role. We also have the mother of St. Mark. She opened her home to service, and because of her love for service, her home got the honor of being the first home to have the liturgy or the Last Supper. So that was another great woman. So again, that was just a very brief kind of overview of women in the New Testament, but there are many, many examples. And now we kind of come to the part that I wanted to focus on. What's the role of women in today's church? What's the role of women in today's society? How does the church view women? So I said I wanted to leave St. Mary in a kind of her own special section. So can anyone think how the church honors St. Mary? What kind of things does the church do to honor her? What's St. Mary's position in our church or in the hearts of the Coptic people?
I don't think that can be answered in a word.
I know. That's why I said I'll leave it to the end. But is there anything that the church has dedicated to St. Mary? Anything that the church does to honor St. How does the church honor St. Mary?
Yeah, like lots of stuff. You got we mentioned her in our liturgy and in midnight praises and stuff like that.
Yep. So we mention her in all the prayers, like the Agbeya prayers, the Book of the Hours. There are so many prayers in every hour that mention St. Mary, like the introduction to the creed itself. So many prayers that so we mention her in every hour of the Agbeya hours. Like you said, Philip, the liturgy, and again we mention her in all parts of the liturgy: Matins, Vespers, the liturgy itself. We have Doxology of St. Mary in the Matins and Vespers, and also you mentioned her a lot in the midnight praises. We have the Thotokeia for every day. So yeah, you're right, that's a really good point, Philip. Anything else? What happens in August? What event takes place in August?
The fast of Saint Mary, where she was like the Assumption of Saint Mary.
Yep. So we have the fast of Saint Mary, and I think that's probably the most loved fast. It's a time where there's kind of venerations, and I've been to. I spent 1 year when I was in Egypt, and honestly, within 10 minutes, they had to shut the doors of the churches because there was no more room. So if you wanted to attend one of the kind of venerations for St. Mary, you had to be there super, super early. And they had like big screens outside the church so people can sit outside and on the streets, like you could hear the praise of St. Mary in the whole kind of neighborhood because they had microphones everywhere. It was really beautiful. So yeah, we have the fast of St. Mary. And even though that's a 2nd degree fast, so you're allowed fish and it's only 2 weeks, a lot of people out of love for St. Mary fast it without fish, like a 1st degree fast. And some people also fast it from the start of August rather than the 7th of August. So obviously that's through like permission of your father of confession, etc. But it's definitely the most loved fast of the year. And actually not just Christians in Egypt, out of people's love for St. Mary, some non-Christians fast her fast as well. So yeah, that's definitely an important event in the church calendar. Anything else that the church does to honor her?
I feel like I failed an exam or something like.
No, it's not an exam. There's no right or wrong answers or no expected answers. We're just brainstorming together.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, please go on.
No, like you said, there's no way that you can summarize this. So even if we come up with ideas, there's so many other things that we'll miss out. So just any ideas that come to your head about how we honor St. Mary.
I mean, we have her icons, for example.
Yep.
And we, icons. Like.
So her icons fill the churches, her icons fill our homes. And actually the Coptic tradition is every church, there are 3 altars, the kind of main altar and then the altar on the right and the altar on the left. So the altar in the middle is always after the saint of the church. So for example, in Kirkcaldy, because it's the Church of St. Mark, the middle kind of altar is like on the curtain, you've got St. Mark. So the church tradition or the church rites are, if the church is not named after St. Mary, so if the middle altar is not after St. Mary, then one of the other altars has to be named in St. Mary. So if you picture kind of Kirkcaldy Church, you've got St. Mark in the middle, and you've got one altar for St. Mary and one altar for St. Mina. So in every church, there has to be an altar for St. Mary. So as well as her icons, there's the altar. So yeah, that's a really good point. Anything else?
I think that's a tradition in the Syriac church as well. Like always
Yeah. Sorry, I'm very ignorant. I don't know much about the kind of other churches, so I can
No, I
only
just
speak for
mentioned
the.
it like because
Yeah,
I thought I should mention it.
yeah. No, please feel free to share. Like I said, it's a bad point of me. I don't really know much about other churches, but I'm sure all the other churches have very beautiful ways of celebrating St. Mary. So it's nice to know that that's what they do in the Syriac church as well.
Yeah, we also have like titles. We give her different titles.
Okay.
Obviously also mentioned in all of the things you mentioned yourself, like in the prayers and hymns and all of it.
Yeah.
Like call her the second heaven. We call her the true wine.
Yep.
Right, stuff like that.
Yeah. Especially in the midnight praises, there's a lot of symbolisms like the rod of iron, the rod of Aaron, the second tabernacle, the dome of, like there's so many symbols of Saint Mary. So yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Philip.
I was thinking of a beautiful tradition in my church, like in the Syriac church, like when the liturgy is like, just before communion, there is a time where you remember all saints, and it's not the commemoration of saints, but it's just, it represents the current time we are living in. Like the liturgy is, it summarizes the entire history of the world basically. So in that time, the priest actually steps back from the altar, like there's a small step where the priest stands on in Syriac churches. So he actually steps down, and the church believes that, or one of the explanations given is actually Saint Mary leads the congregation. That's why the priest is actually stepping back, making place for.
That's really nice. So we don't just honor her we don't just celebrate her in August during her fast, we celebrate her every single month. Every Coptic month. This is so bad, I can't remember if it's the 12th or the 21st of every month, but I think it's the 21st of every.
The
21st. Yeah,
it's the commemoration of her birthday.
Yeah, Archangel Michael's on the 12th of every month. But yeah,
yes.
So we commemorate her every month. And also we have the month of Kiak, where we do praises. And again, obviously the praises are to God and we're glorifying God. But the theme of the entire praise is for Saint Mary. And it is again something that people really, really adore. And they will stay up all night just to praise Saint Mary. Here, I think we've done all-nighters before, I'm not sure, but obviously because of the weather and the distance, we can't stay up all night. But again, in Egypt, they praise the whole night, and then they have the liturgy, and they do this every single day for a month. So the people's love for Saint Mary is great. The church calls her the pride of the human race, and they don't just honor her like the most honored person, they honor her even above the angels. So when we have the hymns of the intercession, Sita Nebrisveya, we mention her before we mention the angels, before we mention the apostles, before we mention anyone. So she's not just the greatest human, she's the greatest of all. Obviously after God, she is the greatest. So we can't say that the church is sexist or the church doesn't honor women when the person that we honor the most is a woman. So, and like you said, we can go on and on and on about Saint Mary. So many monasteries are named after her, so many churches are named after her, so many girls are named after her, not just Mary, but you have all the kind of variations like Maria, Madonna. She has a really, really special place in people's hearts. But she's the church honors her the most. So we can't say the church doesn't give women honor when the person that's most honored is Saint Mary. And not just Saint Mary, there's no difference in the way we honor female and male martyrs. We have their relics, we celebrate their feasts, we have females in the hymns of the intercession, we have females again in the midnight praises. So there's in the commemoration of the saints. So we name our churches after female martyrs and saints. So we don't say, oh, there's a different tradition for male and female martyrs or male and female saints. So the church really, really honors females. And you know the phrase, behind every great man, there's a great woman. So there are so many examples of this. Is really what kind of like what's so amazing about there's all the, if we kind of go through all the amazing men in history and men in the Bible, you'll find that there's a great woman behind them. So Mina, are you with us? I saw your name, but I'm not sure if you're here. If you're here, can you read this verse up for us?
No,
Yeah,
I don't think he's there, but I can read it for you.
Okay, thank you.
It
Yeah,
reads-
he's not, he's away for that, but I just saw his name pop up, so I wasn't sure. Now I can't see who's on and who's not. So yeah, Philip, can you read this verse up for us?
Yeah, no problem. When I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Louise and your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded it is in you also.
So St. Paul here didn't just mention one, but two great women who had an influence on St. Timothy, and St. Timothy obviously was a great bishop. So he said, your faith is because it was handed down from your grandmother and your mother. So St. Timothy is the great man he is because of his great mother and grandmother. Moses, the biggest, most amazing prophet, he was brought up by his mum. So with the whole story when she hid him in a basket and he was found by Pharaoh's wife, and he grew up in Pharaoh's daughter, and he grew up in Pharaoh's palace. He was brought up by his mum, and we all know how great Moses was. Like, God had to hide his body so the Jews wouldn't worship him. Again, behind this great man was a great woman. Samuel, he was one of the great prophets, and this is because his mum really prayed for a child, and she dedicated him to the Lord. She promised that if she had a child, she'd dedicate him to the Lord. So you can imagine his upbringing, and he became a great man in the history of the kind of kings and prophets. We have Abigail. If it wasn't for Abigail, David was going to commit murder. He was going to take revenge. So again, she was the one that calmed him down, and he later married her. So behind the great David, there's the great Abigail. And if we kind of leave the Bible, there are so many saints. So for example, Saint Augustine, who repented and became a great saint. He was the result of his mother's tears. I can't remember how many years Saint Monica cried for, maybe 20. I'm not 100% sure, but that's the number that I heard.
15 years.
15
years.
Yeah, can you imagine the prayers and tears of 15 years? And that's why he became the person he was. So women have an amazing role in the church, is that they're the one that bring up the saint, they're the one that brought up the prophets, the saints, the priests, the monks, the bishops. They are the ones that create all of this. So they have a really amazing role. All these men might have not been here if it wasn't for these great women. I'm not saying that obviously the fathers don't have a role, and they have a great role as well, but the main role, or at least in these stories, were to the women. You have stories like Saint Rachel, who saw her children being martyred on her lap, so they don't deny the faith before she dies. So can you imagine like how much faith this woman had to instill that in all her children so that they're martyred? So the church is full of many mothers that kind of were martyred with their children or martyred as families. So that's a really important role for women. And again, the church really want women to be respected and honored. So this is one of the commands that's said to the groom in the kind of wedding ceremony. So Tia, can you read this out for us?
Yeah. Do all that is good for her. Have compassion on her and always hasten to do that which will gladden her heart.
Sorry, I know it's in kind of old English, so it might not be as meaningful or as powerful, but basically the last bit is always hasten to do which will gladden her heart. Basically, if there's anything that makes her happy, you are commanded to always, like, notice the words always, hasten, like always do it and do it quickly. I remember once I was watching like a kind of youth meeting, so normally questions at the start and then the sermon. So someone said like, Abuna, it's not fair, the church in the marriage ceremony says to the bride, like, you must be obedient to your husband, you must be submissive, that's not fair. And then Abuna was like, yeah, but the church says to the groom, always hasten to do which will gladden her. Do you understand how difficult that is? That is like a bigger commandment than any. That is really like, the church is basically saying to the groom, you have to always keep your wife happy, always, and do it quickly. Anything she wants, anything that will make her happy, it is a command that you do it and do it quickly. So that is how much the church and they instruct the groom, do all that is good for her, have compassion on her. This is just a tiny bit of the whole commandment, but this is how much the church wants women to be looked after and women to be loved and women to be cared for. So it's a really, this was definitely the favorite part. And it's usually a really emotional part in the kind of marriage ceremonies. It's usually the part that everyone really gets moved. But both for the groom and the bride, their commandments, they're really beautiful. Our church is so amazing and so wise. But then, so despite all of that, we can say, but that's not fair. Women can't be priests. So how can we say that the church is inclusive or the church is equal when all the ranks of priesthood from deacon to bishop to pope are men? But we can, the church has to obey what God's done. So when God chose priests in the Old Testament, he started with Aaron and his sons. So God chose in the Old Testament males to be priests, and in the New Testament he chose all male apostles. So if it's a system that God put, we as a church have to be obedient. We can't change it. We can't say, oh, actually we want to be baptized in oil rather than water, or actually communion instead of bread, we're going to use potatoes. We can't change anything that God has. God was the one who established the priesthood sacrament, so we can't come and say that's not fair. Why does the church not allow to do this? It's God who established this, and obviously, God forbid, we're not going to say that God's unfair. So this is a system that God put in place, and because it's not because he favors men over women. When he chose to come and do the plan of salvation, it was through a woman that this all happened. But God, we have different roles, so it's not because they're superior to us or they're any better than, that's just the system God put in place for every it's like saying, why can't men have the blessing of motherhood? That's just God gave that to women. Like we noticed all these people that we mentioned, they had such a great influence because they were mothers, they're closer to their children. So God has different roles for different genders, and it's not about equality, or it's not about who's better than the other. And this is something that we can't debate. It's something that we can't do anything because it was put by God himself, and the church cannot change anything that was established by God. There are some things that the church can change. Some things change with culture, some things change with time. That's to do with the rites and the traditions, but the sacraments, every sacrament was established by God himself. So we don't have, it's not up to us. We as a church have to be obedient and submissive. So we can't say that God is the most fair. He's not a person, but you know what I mean? He's the most fair person on earth. He's so merciful. He's so loving. He's so caring. He wouldn't do anything that's not fair, but that's just the system that he put in place. So we just have to submit to that, to God, basically. That's in his wisdom. He said that priesthood is for males, but that's no indication at all that women are any less, because God wants women to serve in the church, but serve in different roles. And this kind of always reminds me of this picture. Equality doesn't equal equity. So we can't say men are priests, so women should be priests. That's like saying the picture on the left, we give each person the same height of box. So one person will be able to see, one person can hardly see, and one person can't see at all. That's not fair. There's a difference between equality and fairness. So we don't know what, God obviously had wisdom, but we don't know why he said women not to be priests, but that's nothing to do with fairness. Sorry, yeah, that's nothing to do with fairness. We can still be fair, doesn't have to be equal. So there are things, blessings that God has given women and blessings that God has given men. So the picture on the right, you can see one person doesn't have a box, one person has a box, and one person has two boxes. But that's fair. They're all having a good vision. So it doesn't mean like, oh, men do this if it's only fair if we're the exact same as them. No, God designed us different physically, designed us emotionally, psychologically different. So he's given both of us blessings, different blessings, but kind of the same value. I know kind of different churches have different views on this, and different churches have allowed women to be priests, but we follow exactly what's written in the Bible, and we follow exactly what Christ established, and we follow exactly what was handed down by the apostles. So we have to submit to God. Yeah, that's the kind of concluding message. So I hope that's given you an insight of, since the creation, women have been honored, women have been equal. That was through the Old Testament, the New Testament, and in the church. And of course, there could be still some inequalities, but that's not due to God, or that's not due to the church. That's just due to people. The church is a place for people, and people aren't perfect. So, for example, I was reading when I was preparing this that there was in one church, I don't know if this was kind of stopped during COVID in our church. I'm not sure what was happening in St. Mark's. But do you remember before, after communion, we always had a drink of water? We've started putting that back in place now. We stopped it temporarily because of COVID. But yeah, we have after communion, as kind of respect for the communion, make sure that everything's kind of swallowed. We had little water cups, and normally little girls just fill that. They just keep it at the back of the church. Everyone after communion has a drink. So one time in one church, there was the girl just filling the cup, and the boy came over to her and shouted at her. He's like, "How can you do this? This is my role as a deacon. You're not allowed to touch this, etc., etc." Yes, that's sexist. Yes, that's unfair. Yes, that's discriminatory. But that's not to do with the church or to do with God. So there will be, if there are things happening in the church that you feel is unfair or whatever, that the church can't be blamed for this, or God can't be blamed for this. Just like there are not just issues to do with like women in the church, there are lots of other issues, lots of other problems. But that's not because the church is unfair or God's unfair. That's just because people do mistakes, and that's what the church is for. The church is not a museum for saints, it's a hospital for sinners. So God give us like the grace and the wisdom for people to change their behavior. And yeah, obviously if there's something that you see that's not fair or that doesn't contradict God's, like the commandments and the church rules, yes, speak out. I'm not saying don't speak out, but yeah, just it's important to differentiate between people's behavior and actual church and God. So that's me done. Abuna, do you have any comments that you'd like to add before we kind of open up for questions? Or